The economy of Argentina is a high-income economy, Latin America's third largest, and the second largest in South America behind Brazil. The country benefits from rich natural resources, a highly literate population, an export-oriented agricultural sector, and a diversified industrial base. Argentina's economic performance has historically been very uneven, in which high economic growth alternated with severe recessions, particularly during the late 20th century, and income maldistribution and poverty increased. Early in the 20th century, Argentina had one of the highest per capita GDP levels in the world and the third largest economy in the developing world. Today a high-income economy, Argentina maintains a relatively high quality of life and GDP per capita. Argentina is considered an emerging market by the FTSE Global Equity Index, and is one of the G20 major economies. History. Prior to the 1880s, Argentina was a relatively isolated backwater, dependent on the salted meat, wool, leather, and hide industries for both the greater part of its foreign exchange and the generation of domestic income and profits. The Argentine economy began to experience swift growth after 1880 through the export of livestock and grain commodities, as well as through British and French investment, marking the beginning of a 50-year era of significant economic expansion and mass European immigration. During its most vigorous period, from 1880 to 1905, this expansion resulted in a 7.5-fold growth in GDP, averaging about 8% annually. One important measure of development, GDP per capita, rose from 35% of the United States average to about 80% during that period. Growth then slowed considerably, such that by 1941 Argentina's real per capita GDP was roughly half that of the US. Throughout the period from 1890 to 1950, the country's per capita income was similar to that of Western Europe, although income in Argentina remained considerably less evenly distributed. The Great Depression caused Argentine GDP to fall by a fourth between 1929 and 1932. Having recovered its lost ground by the late 1930s partly through import substitution, the economy continued to grow modestly during World War II. The war led to a reduced availability of imports and higher prices for Argentine exports that combined to create a $1.6 billion cumulative surplus, a third of which was blocked as inconvertible deposits in the Bank of England by the Roca-Runciman Treaty. Benefiting from innovative self-financing and government loans alike, value added in manufacturing nevertheless surpassed that of agriculture for the first time in 1943, employed over 1 million by 1947, and allowed the need for imported consumer goods to decline from 40% of the total to 10% by 1950. The populist administration of Juan Perón nationalized the central bank, railways, and other strategic industries and services from 1945 to 1955. The subsequent enactment of developmentalism after 1958, though partial, was followed by a promising 15 years. Inflation first became a chronic problem during this period, but though it did not become fully developed, from 1932 to 1974 Argentina's economy grew almost fivefold while its population only doubled. While unremarkable, this expansion was well distributed and so resulted in several noteworthy changes in Argentine society, most notably the development of the largest proportional middle class in Latin America as well as the region's highest paid, most unionized working class. The economy, however, declined during the military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, and for some time afterwards. The dictatorship's chief economist, José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, advanced a corrupt, anti-labor policy of financial liberalization that increased the debt burden and interrupted industrial development and upward social mobility. Over 400,000 companies of all sizes went bankrupt by 1982, and neoliberal economic policies prevailing from 1983 through 2001 failed to reverse the situation. Record foreign debt interest payments, tax evasion, and capital flight resulted in a balance of payments crisis that plagued Argentina with severe stagflation from 1975 to 1990, including a bout of hyperinflation in 1989 and 1990. Attempting to remedy this, economist Domingo Cavallo pegged the peso to the US dollar in 1991 and limited the growth in the money supply. His team then embarked on a path of trade liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. Inflation dropped to single digits and GDP grew by 1/3 in 4 years. External economic shocks, as well as a dependency on volatile short-term capital and debt to maintain the overvalued fixed exchange rate, diluted benefits, causing erratic economic growth from 1995 and the eventual collapse in 2001. That year and the next, the economy suffered its sharpest decline since 1930. By 2002, Argentina had defaulted on its debt. Its GDP had declined by nearly 20% in 4 years, unemployment reached 25%, and the peso had depreciated 70% after being devalued and floated. Expansionary policies and commodity exports triggered a rebound in GDP from 2003 onwards. This trend has been largely maintained, creating over 5 million jobs and encouraging domestic consumption and fixed investment. Social programs were strengthened, and a number of important firms privatized during the 1990s were renationalized beginning in 2003. These include the Postal Service, pension funds, Aerolíneas Argentinas, the energy firm YPF, and the railways. The socio-economic situation in Argentina has been steadily improving. The economy nearly doubled from 2002 to 2011, growing an average of 7.1% annually and around 9% for 5 consecutive years between 2003 and 2007. Real wages rose by around 72% from their low point in 2003 to 2013. The global recession did affect the economy in 2009, with growth slowing to nearly zero, but high economic growth then resumed, and GDP expanded by around 9% in both 2010 and 2011. Foreign exchange controls, austerity measures, persistent inflation, and downturns in Brazil, Europe, and other important trade partners contributed to slower growth beginning in 2012. However, growth averaged just 1.3% from 2012 to 2014. The Argentine government bond market is based on GDP-linked bonds, and investors, both foreign and domestic, netted record yields amid renewed growth. Argentine debt restructuring offers in 2005 and 2010 resumed payments on the majority of its almost $100 billion in defaulted bonds and other debt. From 2001, holdouts controlling 7% of the bonds, including some small investors, hedge funds, and vulture funds led by Paul Singer's Cayman Islands-based NML Capital Limited, rejected the 2005 and 2010 offers to exchange their defaulted bonds. Singer, who demands $832 million for Argentine bonds purchased for $49 million in the secondary market in 2008, has attempted to seize Argentine government assets abroad and has filed lawsuits to stop payments from Argentina to the 93% who had accepted the earlier swaps despite the steep discount. Bondholders who instead accepted the 2005 offer of 30 cents on the dollar had by 2012 received returns of about 90% according to estimates by Morgan Stanley. While the Argentine government considers debt left over from illegitimate governments unconstitutional odious debt, It has continued servicing this debt despite the annual cost of around $14 billion and despite being nearly locked out of the international credit markets, with average annual bond issues since 2002 averaging less than $2 billion. Argentina has nevertheless continued to hold successful bond issues, as the country's stock market, consumer confidence, and overall economy continue to grow.